Ed Sullivan truly lost it. When this happened, Ed Sullivan smiled at millions every Sunday night. But in 1955, something happened that made him snap. A young musician changed one song, and Sullivan exploded with words so shocking, witnesses couldn't believe it. He used a racial slur that destroyed his carefully built image. The fight almost turned physical. Staff had to hold them apart. For decades, no one talked about it. The musician was banned forever. But what he did on live TV that night changed rock and roll history. Ed Sullivan came into the world on September 28, 1901, as one half of a set of twins in Harlem, New York. His twin brother, Daniel, was sickly from birth and survived only a few months. Ed was left as the only surviving twin, carrying a loss that created a shadow over his childhood. Even as a boy, he felt an emptiness, a quiet sadness that shaped him. His parents, Peter and Elizabeth, were Irish and had a big family. Ed was the third of 8 children, but only 5 survived infancy. The house was full of life and grief at the same time. When Ed was just 5, another tragedy hit. His baby sister died, breaking the family's heart again. Elizabeth couldn't stand the pain anymore. She decided they would leave Harlem and move to Port Chester, a small town north of the city. Port Chester was calmer and more peaceful. Ed's parents hoped the change would help them heal, but the losses never really left him. Even as a young boy, Ed learned to live with sadness. Despite this, Ed survived, and people often called him the miracle child. Born into a neighborhood where Irish and Jewish families lived side by side, he grew up surrounded by different cultures and music. Cars began replacing horse-drawn carriages, and Ed took it all in. Though he was one of 8 children, only 5 lived past infancy. Every day was a reminder that life was fragile. His parents held him close, especially his mother. To them, he was their miracle. In the house, grief was never far away, but music helped. The Sullivans sang together around the piano, filling the rooms with sound. Music was their way of coping. It was a habit that would stay with Ed forever. Even years later, as a famous television host, he would remember those early days and how a song could make hard things feel lighter. As he grew older, Ed also began to show his need for control. In high school, he was a star athlete. Between 1916 and 1919, he earned 12 athletic letters. On the football field, he was a tough halfback. On the basketball court, a quick guard. On the track, a fast sprinter. But it was baseball where he truly shined as catcher and captain. These sports shaped him. They built his discipline and showed him how to lead. And he loved to lead. Ed was captain of the baseball team, telling his teammates where to stand and how to play. Championships followed, and so did his reputation. That role gave him a sense of authority, something that would matter even more in his career. At 17, when America joined World War I, Ed ran away to Chicago to try to enlist in the Navy. But he was too young and had no papers, so they sent him home. That failed attempt showed his boldness. It also pushed him toward a different path. By then, Ed had also discovered writing. At school, he wrote sports columns and edited the school newspaper. Right after graduation, the Port Chester Daily Item hired him. They paid him $1 per article, and Ed loved every bit of it. It was the start of his journalism career, one that would take him to the Hartford Post, the New York Evening Mail, the Associated Press, and eventually the New York Evening Graphic. Sports and writing had always been his passions, and they prepared him for a much bigger stage. Sports also taught Ed about fairness. Growing up, he played alongside black athletes without thinking much about it. It felt natural to him. When he traveled to Connecticut for games and met teams with black players, He never thought it was strange. That belief in equality stayed with him. Later, when he had his own television show, Ed Sullivan would give black performers a platform even when other hosts would not. Ed Sullivan thought moving to the Hartford Post in 1919 would be a big career jump. Coming from the Port Chester Daily Item, he hoped for new opportunities at a larger paper. But that plan fell apart almost immediately. Within his very first week on the job, the Hartford Post folded, leaving him unemployed before he even had time to settle in. It was a strange and unlucky setback, especially since newspapers were thriving at that time. Papers rarely shut their doors after just a few days. Sullivan had to look for work all over again, realizing how unpredictable the newspaper world could be. Even so, this did not slow him down. Instead, it made him more determined to keep going. That quick and painful lesson shaped his drive and resilience early on. When the Hartford Post failed, Sullivan managed to pick himself up and join the New York Evening Mail as a sports reporter. But in 1923, that paper also shut down. This began a rough period where he bounced from one failing newspaper to another. From 1923 to 1927, he moved between the Associated Press, the Philadelphia Bulletin, the Morning World, the Morning Telegraph, the New York Bulletin, and the Leader. Every time one paper went under, he had to look for a new position. This was a tough cycle, and most people would have quit. Sullivan simply refused to give up. Each job became a chance to improve his skills and grow his network. Though it was exhausting and uncertain, it showed his true passion for journalism. The years at the Associated Press were especially important. The AP was one of the most respected news organizations in the world. Even though Sullivan kept freelancing with other papers like the Philadelphia Bulletin and the Morning Telegraph, working at the AP gave him national stories and more serious assignments. This period lasted until 1927, and Sullivan learned to report on everything from sports to breaking news. Even in the middle of constant job changes, he built a solid reputation as someone who could adapt and deliver strong stories. By the time he left the AP, he had proven himself as a capable reporter. That same year, Sullivan took his next big step. In 1927, he joined the New York Evening Graphic as a sports writer. The Graphic was loud and flashy, with a reputation for bold, often scandalous stories. Sullivan thrived there and moved up quickly. Soon he was sports editor, which was his first stable leadership role. The Graphic was also where he met Walter Winchell, one of the most famous gossip columnists of the time. When Winchell left for the Daily Mirror in 1929, Sullivan became the Graphic's Broadway columnist. That column introduced him to the world of show business and gave him a new kind of influence. The Graphic folded in 1932, but by then Sullivan was already a name people knew. In 1932, he became the Broadway columnist for the New York Daily News. That was when he began his famous column, Little Old New York. For 42 years, until 1974, readers checked it every day. Sullivan wrote about Broadway shows, famous actors, and the secret lives of the city's biggest stars. People loved his voice because it was fair, sharp, and always inside the action. A single mention from Sullivan could make someone famous overnight. His column was syndicated too, so readers outside of New York could follow the drama. Year after year, Sullivan adapted to every new twist in the entertainment world. That's what kept him at the top. Sullivan was also a talent scout. Little Old New York was more than just gossip. It was where new actors and performers got their big break. Sullivan knew how to recognize talent before anyone else. One kind word in his column could jumpstart a career. On the other hand, if he didn't like someone, a quick remark could ruin a reputation. Actors and producers checked his column every morning because they knew one line could decide the future of their show. Sullivan wasn't just reporting the news, he was shaping it. Outside the newspaper offices, you could see him at all the big parties and theater openings. Wherever something happened, Sullivan was there. But the nightlife of New York was its own battleground too. Sullivan set up shop at the famous El Morocco Club. That became his unofficial headquarters. Across town, his rival Walter Winchell held court at the Stork Club. Both men fought for attention in these glitzy spots where movie stars and politicians spent their nights. Every famous face that walked through the doors was part of the contest. Winchell's Stork Club was famous for its strict door policy and exclusive crowd. Sullivan's El Morocco was famous for its glamour and its power. Between them, these two columnists ruled New York's nightlife, and everyone felt their rivalry. It became one of the most talked about stories in the city. Being seen at either club could make or break a reputation, and Sullivan wasn't satisfied with just writing. Like Winchell, he decided to conquer radio too. In 1932, he launched his first radio show, The Ed Sullivan Show, on CBS. That show brought him new listeners and big-name guests like Jack Benny and George M. Cohan. Sullivan kept going, hosting Ed Sullivan Variety in 1941, Ed Sullivan Entertains from 1943 to 1944, and Ed Sullivan's Pipelines in 1946. Each show brought his name into more homes. Radio was perfect for him. It gave him a bigger audience and a quicker way to share showbiz gossip. People began to trust him as a voice they could recognize. Radio proved that he could do more than write. In 1948, CBS decided to take a big chance. They hired Ed Sullivan to host their new Sunday night variety show called Toast of the Town. Sullivan was a newspaper columnist with no TV experience. Marlo Lewis, one of CBS's producers, thought Sullivan's plain style might work. Sullivan wasn't sure. "Everything they're promising to do is something I've already done," he joked. The first episode aired on June 20, 1948, with a tiny budget of $1,375. Even Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were paid just $200 to appear. Sponsors were scared. Executives worried he wasn't flashy enough. But CBS boss William Paley believed in him. Sullivan fought to get top guests and shaped the show into a success that lasted more than 20 years. That success did not come without pain. Critics hated him. They thought his wooden delivery was awful. Harriet Van Horn wrote that he had no personality at all. Other critics said he was stiff, awkward, and hopeless. Sullivan took it personally. Once, he even wrote Van Horn a short, nasty letter. But people at home kept watching. Even Alan King joked that Sullivan did nothing, but did it better than anyone. Sullivan learned to take it. He let comedians impersonate him. That made him more popular. Audiences liked that he could laugh at himself. Even though critics sneered, viewers kept coming back. Sullivan's strange style became part of the show's identity. On camera, he looked tense. His shoulders were always hunched. His voice was nasal. Some thought he had Bell's palsy. Time magazine compared his smile to someone sucking a lemon, but there was nothing wrong with him. Many people wrote to him praising his courage. Comedians copied his wooden movements. That helped make him famous. Sullivan never fought this image. In fact, he embraced it. That honesty and humor made him one of the most beloved figures in entertainment. By 1953, the show had moved to a new home, CBS Studio 50 at 1697 Broadway. It was an old theater built in 1927. Inside, it was grand, with a Gothic ceiling and stained glass. It took work to fit cameras and gear inside. Even the nearby subway had to be shielded so it wouldn't cause interference. Sullivan loved this theater. In 1967, to celebrate 20 years on the air, CBS renamed it the Ed Sullivan Theater. That was a rare honor for a TV star. Today that theater is still standing. David Letterman and Stephen Colbert would later call it home. But most people remember it for Sullivan and the many stars who played there. At first, people still called the show Toast of the Town. Sullivan thought this didn't give him enough credit. Audiences already thought of it as his show. On September 25, 1955, CBS renamed it The Ed Sullivan Show. That mattered to Sullivan. It proved his place as one of TV's most powerful men. A year later, he would feature Elvis Presley. Elvis pulled in 60 million viewers. That was a record for TV at the time. The new name and that huge audience cemented Sullivan's fame forever. But Sullivan wasn't always easy to work with. On November 20, 1955, Bo Diddley was backstage. Sullivan heard him sing 16 Tons, a huge hit by Tennessee Ernie Ford. That song had sold over 1 million copies in just 3 weeks. Sullivan told Diddley to play it. Diddley agreed, probably thinking it would help his career. But when he saw cue cards reading Bo Diddley 16 Tons, he thought he was meant to do both. On air, he chose to play his own song, Bo Diddley, instead. That choice created one of the most rebellious moments in early TV. Diddley was part of an R&B segment. When he played his own hit, the crowd went wild. Sullivan was furious. Diddley's raw energy and famous rhythm made a strong impression. Many Americans heard that infectious Bo Diddley beat for the first time. Even though it was just 2 minutes, it changed rock and roll forever. When the cameras stopped, Sullivan was angry. He yelled at Diddley. According to Diddley and witnesses, Sullivan even called him the first black boy to ever double-cross him. That was a shocking, racist remark. Sullivan had fought for black artists in the past, but here he revealed his prejudice and temper. The fight was heated. Staff had to hold them back. The fight nearly turned into a brawl. Diddley wanted to punch Sullivan. Diddley's manager tried to calm him. "That's Ed Sullivan," the manager warned. Diddley didn't care. Sullivan told him that he'd never work on TV again. "You won't last 6 months," Sullivan snapped. Diddley was banned from returning. Ed Sullivan was loved by millions on television, but his daughter Betty has told a very different story. She said that her father had a notorious temper that could explode over the smallest things. In public, Ed was calm and charming. In private, he was quick to anger. Betty recalled one incident at home that started with a tiny disagreement and ended with Ed shouting and slamming doors. Family members learned to tread carefully around him. They never knew what might set him off. This temper was something he rarely showed on screen. It stayed hidden behind the polite smile that everyone knew. But at home, it was very real, and those who loved him had to live with this unpredictable side every day. Betty also described how Ed was not at all like his public persona when the cameras were off. People thought of him as friendly and outgoing because of his show. In truth, he was quite introverted. He liked to spend time alone. After a broadcast, instead of celebrating or talking with guests, he would often hide in his dressing room. Even at home, he could spend hours reading the newspaper or watching television in silence. This wasn't a temporary mood. It was his natural way of being. That contrast between the public image of a sociable host and the private reality of a solitary man was so strong that even the people who worked with him sometimes thought he was aloof or cold. There was also a darker side to his worries during the height of the Cold War. Betty told one story about Ed becoming convinced that her boyfriend was a communist sympathizer. It happened sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s when fear of communism was everywhere in America. Ed grilled Betty about the boy's background. He considered banning him from the house. He even asked other people for advice because he thought his daughter was mixed up with a subversive. It was an unfounded suspicion with no evidence at all. Even someone like Ed Sullivan, who publicly supported civil rights and welcomed African American performers on his show, could not escape the paranoia of that time. Ed was also a guarded man when it came to his emotions. His grandson, Rob Precht, has explained that Ed rarely showed affection or talked about feelings. Rob believed Ed built up this emotional mask to hide pain. Ed had a twin brother who died as a baby and a sister who passed away when she was young. These losses left him careful about his feelings. Even as an adult, he kept a stoic face and held himself back. Rob thought this was part of what made Ed seem cold to strangers and even to some family. But beneath that hard exterior was a man who felt more than he could say. It was part of what shaped his character and how he handled the pressures of fame. That same tension between public image and private behavior showed up in his dealings with performers too. On September 17, 1967, the Doors were set to play live on his show. Before they went on stage, the producers told them they had to change a lyric in "Light My Fire." They wanted the word "higher" cut out because they thought it hinted at drug use. The band nodded and agreed during rehearsal, telling the producers what they wanted to hear. But as soon as they left the room, Jim Morrison told the others they weren't going to change a thing. The rest of the band backed him up even though they were nervous. Guitarist Robbie Krieger said later, "I thought they were kidding. I said, fuck it, let's do it the way that we do it." They decided they would not give in. That night, the show was live. Ed introduced them politely as always. They played one song, then started into "Light My Fire." The cameras rolled. Millions were watching. And at the exact moment that mattered, Morrison sang, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." The crowd loved it. Backstage, the mood was very different. The producers were angry. Ed Sullivan himself came into their dressing room after the show. Eyewitnesses said he was furious, swearing at them and telling them they had violated the trust of the show and the network. The band was told all future appearances were canceled. The Doors were unfazed. When someone told them they would never play on the show again, Jim Morrison gave a famous reply. With a calm shrug and a bit of a smirk, he said, "But we just did." That one sentence summed up the spirit of the band. They had gotten what they wanted. They had been on one of the biggest platforms in America, and they had stayed true to themselves. Even decades later, that moment still lives on in interviews, documentaries, and movies. On January 15, 1967, the Rolling Stones appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. They were set to sing their new single, "Let's Spend the Night Together." But the show's producers and CBS thought the title was too suggestive for family TV. They told the band to change the words or not go on at all. Under pressure, the Stones agreed. They sang, "Let's Spend Some Time Together" instead. It was a big deal at the time. American television was strict, and they thought the original lyrics were too rebellious. Even though the Stones agreed, they weren't happy. The incident became famous. It showed the fight between rock music and TV censorship. It also showed how much power television had over artists. Radio stations followed suit. Many of them bleeped the word "night," or they wouldn't play the song at all. That hurt the song's success in America. On the other hand, the UK didn't care. The song wasn't censored there, but even then, the Stones had a rebellious image. People already knew them for pushing boundaries. Their controversial lip sync on Sunday night at the London Palladium added to their reputation. The Ed Sullivan moment stayed in everyone's minds as one of the most famous censorship battles in rock history. During the show, Mick Jagger decided to make a point. Every time he sang "Let's spend some time together?" He rolled his eyes at the camera. It was a small move, but people noticed. The eye rolls were clear and full of sarcasm. It was his way of saying they weren't okay with the change. The crowd saw it, and so did the producers. The eye rolls became famous as a quiet form of protest. Unlike Jim Morrison of The Doors, who refused to change his lyrics and got banned, the Stones had agreed to change the words, but they didn't give up their spirit. Mick's eye rolls showed they could follow the rules and still mock them at the same time. Many people thought this was planned. Others thought it was just Mick being himself. Either way, it was unforgettable. Even today, people talk about those few seconds as a perfect example of how a band could rebel without breaking the rules. A few years before this, there was another famous fight with Ed Sullivan. On October 19, 1964, comedian Jackie Mason appeared on the show. President Lyndon B. Johnson made a live announcement, and Mason's act was cut short. When the show returned, Sullivan held up 2 fingers off-screen to tell Mason he had 2 minutes left. Mason began making jokes about fingers. He kept pointing at people and saying, "Here's a finger for you and a finger for you." Sullivan thought Mason was making an obscene gesture at him. From Sullivan's view, Mason's thumb looked like a middle finger. Sullivan was furious. After the show, he canceled Mason's contract for 6 appearances. That contract was worth $45,000 at the time, over $450,000 in today's money. Sullivan told the press that Mason was unpredictable and sick. Mason denied ever flipping Sullivan off, but nobody believed him. Mason sued Sullivan for libel, but he lost. The media covered the story everywhere. Mason's career took a serious hit. Sullivan was powerful. A fight with him meant losing work. Mason was banned from most television. It took him almost 20 years to recover. Even after Sullivan apologized and brought him back on the show, Mason's name was still damaged. People remembered him as the comic who messed up on live TV. Producers thought he was too risky to book. Mason was forced to do small clubs and bit parts. Only years later did he rebuild his career. Even then, everyone still remembered the finger incident. It was a harsh lesson about crossing someone like Sullivan. Sullivan wasn't just a host, he was a gatekeeper. Going against him could destroy a career. Sullivan was also strict about who appeared on his show. Many artists had to follow his rules. Even big names like Elvis Presley had to film from the waist up, and Sullivan often decided what was acceptable. But he also had a side that few expected. Even though he could be controlling and harsh, he booked more black performers than most hosts at the time. Starting in 1948, Sullivan gave African American singers, dancers, and musicians a national stage. This was at a time when racism and segregation were still common. Some sponsors told him to stop booking them. Once, a Ford executive told him to stop. Sullivan kicked him out of the theater. Sullivan told people that talent mattered more than bigotry. On his show, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Sammy Davis Jr., The Supremes, The Temptations, and James Brown all performed. Even civil rights leaders like Coretta Scott King appeared. Sullivan took real risks. Many people loved him for that. Others thought he was two-faced. Behind the scenes, he was known to blacklist performers who crossed him, like Bo Diddley. But on screen, he promoted black talent more than most. Sullivan kept his show on air for 23 years. It ran on CBS from June 20, 1948 to June 6, 1971. That's over 1,000 episodes. Every Sunday, millions of Americans tuned in. Sullivan introduced them to everyone from Elvis Presley to the Beatles. Comedy stars like Richard Pryor and Carol Burnett also performed. When the Beatles played on February 9, 1964, about 73 million people watched. That was a record at the time. Sullivan was famous for his strict control. Elvis was shown only from the waist up. The Rolling Stones had to change their lyrics. Even so, performing on Sullivan could make or break a career. When CBS finally canceled the show in 1971, it felt like the end of an era. Sullivan himself didn't live long after that. His wife Sylvia died on March 16, 1973. They had been married since April 28, 1930, after meeting in 1926. They kept their relationship secret at first because she was Jewish and he was Catholic. They even told her family that Sullivan's name was Ed Solomon. Finally, they eloped at City Hall in 1930. 8 months later, they had a daughter named Elizabeth. The Sullivans were a team. Sylvia often gave Ed honest feedback after every show. When she died in 1973, he was devastated. A year later, Sullivan himself was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. His family decided not to tell him the full truth. They thought it would upset him too much. Within weeks, Sullivan was gone. He died on October 13, 1974, at 73. His funeral was at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Paul McCartney later recalled seeing him and realizing Sullivan didn't remember who he was. Sullivan had changed so much by then. His daughter Betty and his grandson Rob spoke about Sullivan's controlling side years later. Betty had married the show's producer Bob Precht in 1952. She had seen up close how Ed managed every tiny detail. Sullivan was famous for his perfectionism. Even his family felt it. Rob told stories about how Sullivan was both kind and tough. The same man who loved his family also banned performers who upset him. These revelations showed the other side of a man who most people thought was just a stiff TV host. Sullivan could be warm one moment and furious the next. Even though millions watched him every Sunday, only his family really saw this part of him, and they felt it long after the cameras stopped.